Today we are here to honor the memory of a woman named Henrietta Lacks. And our invocation comes from Dorothy Baruch. Come all you who seek truth, abide in love and honor peace. Enter into this house with thanksgiving. Come into these gates with praise. Enter into this sacred space, all you who hunger for righteousness. Through these doors, all footsteps lead to the source of our being, where we shall be filled. I now invite our worship associate, Lyndon Youth, to come up and light the chalice while we read the chalice lighting words together, which are in your order of service. We kindle this flame, symbol of our faith, for the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of love, which calls us to work for justice. You may be seated.
Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation. As Rachel said, my name is Lyndon Youth, and I'm happy to be your worship associate this morning. It's so wonderful to see everyone here. I want you to know that Valley UU is a welcoming community, and no matter who you are or wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome here. I'd like to take just a moment to remind you to turn off electronic devices that may make noise during the service. I can't talk today. You may leave them on silent if you wish to tweet or to post good things that you hear during the service and share the good news with your friends and family. I'd also invite anyone who needs some time away. I don't think there are little ones in the congregation this morning, that we do have a comfort room on your right. It does have a speaker in it, so you won't miss any of the service. And I was also asked to find out if this looks familiar to anyone. It was left in the ladies' room this morning. No?
It's a children's.
It belongs to a child. Well, that doesn't necessarily leave out anyone here. I'd like to take a moment to welcome guests to our community. If you are visiting this morning, could you please stand or raise your hand or rise otherwise in body or spirit so we may recognize you? I recognize someone from UCT out there. After the service, feel free to pick up some refreshments and then join members of the congregation at our welcome service circle by the piano. You'll see the sign on the wall there. Today, VU member Rachel Kulik is speaking on our first Unitarian Universalist principle, honoring the inherent worth and dignity of each individual. And Robert Walsh writes, I can meet life in many ways. I can be tough-minded, I can be tender-hearted, I can move between activity and quietness. I can express my uniqueness and individuality, and I can forget myself in commitment to family and community. I can judge, I can bear witness to the good and the evil around me, and I can forgive. I can analyze, theologize, figure the world out, and I can listen to the still small voice of conscience, intuition, and the Holy Spirit. Welcome.
As I said before, today we're honoring Henrietta Lacks. One of the ways we've been doing this already is by singing some of the spirituals. Her children said that those were their favorites to sing around the house. And for our offertory words, we're going to be honoring her Christian tradition. So our offertory words today come from Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We will now receive the offering. Prayer and meditation. Here in this space, we are gathered, called by our sense of urgency or duty, or the longing for community, called to be together on this day. Here in this space, we are gathered, called to hold ourselves accountable to our values, to remind ourselves of those hopes and dreams and possibilities for which sometimes in the rough and tumble world, it can be hard to hold on to belief. Here in this space, we are gathered, called to do our part in weaving a web of human community. Here in this space, some of us have come in pain. I ask for healing prayers and thoughts for my dad. For those of you who don't know, on Thursday he was riding his bike and got hit by a car. He says he's doing fine. He has lots of scratches and bruises, but nothing's broken. And I appreciate all of you who have been sending good thoughts our way. I ask that you send a few more healing thoughts to him, that he heals quickly and with as little pain as possible. To those of you who are dealing with health issues, we pray, we wish for courage and healing. May we pause and hold gently all the concerns, named and unnamed, that are gathered in this room today. Quite possibly going to be a defining day in your life. Most likely you have never heard of this woman or seen one of the 2 pictures that exist of her. Named Henrietta Lacks. Until about 2 months ago, I had never heard of Henrietta Lacks. And I never expected to hear a story about one person that could completely alter my perception of so many things in our world. Someone who has had such a huge impact on our nation, our well-being as humans, and continues to have an impact every day. But in every class I've ever been in, I never heard her name mentioned once. Not once. And once I heard her story, that shocked me. It also shocked me that I'd never heard of her in Unitarian Universalist circles. Why had we never honored her or discussed her and the amazing impact she's had on all of us, even though we had no idea? I figured it was probably because, like me, we didn't know she existed. But why did it take my roommate complaining about a novel she had to read for her class at ASU for me to even find out Henrietta's story? How is it possible that me, the keeper of the most useless and random facts in the world, had no idea who she was? I read Wikipedia for fun. How is it possible that I had gone through my 22 long years of life and never known who she was or what she did? It astounded me. Her story presents such a dilemma, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. And it will probably make you feel uncomfortable too. But I think that her legacy deserves that feeling a little bit. So today is the day that we talk about Henrietta Lacks and her immoral immortality. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant in 1920, and no one is really quite sure how her name became Henrietta, but they say it did. Her mother died in childbirth, giving birth to her 10th child, and her father decided that, well, he couldn't handle 10 kids, and I'm not quite sure if I could handle 10 kids. So John sent his kids off to live with different relatives. Henrietta ended up with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks. Tommy Lacks was also taking care of Henrietta's cousin, David, and as Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, put it years and years later, there were only so many rooms, and once you get cousins sharing rooms, it eventually leads to marriage. And it did. They were married on April 10th, 1941, after they'd already had 2 children, the first when Henrietta was 14. At the end of 1941, the Lacks family was convinced to leave their tobacco farm home in Virginia and move to a steel mill. They were offering decent pay for African Americans at the time, so they moved to Maryland, into one of the largest and youngest African American communities in Baltimore County. Day and Henrietta had 5 children together. Lawrence, who was born in 1935, Elsie, born in 1939, David Sonny Jr. in 1947, Deborah in 1949, and Joseph, who was born in 1950, who later converted to Islam and changed his name legally now to Zachariah Bari Abdul Rahman. Elsie was described as her family as different, to say the least, and in their times it was called deaf and dumb. And she was sadly institutionalized in 1950. That was custom at the time. Elsie lived the rest of her life at what was then called the Hospital for the Negro Insane, before dying in 1955. They say that putting her daughter into the institution tore Henrietta apart. 4.5 months after giving birth to Joseph, Henrietta was bleeding profusely and having severe pain. Her friends remembered her telling them that she had, quote, a knot in her womb, and she knew there was something wrong. After her doctor first tested her for syphilis and it came back negative, Henrietta was referred to Johns Hopkins. Rebecca Skloot, the author of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, wrote, quote, Hopkins was one of the top hospitals in the country. It was built in 1889 as a charity hospital for the sick and poor, and it covered more than 12 acres, where a cemetery and an insane asylum once sat in East Baltimore. The public wards at Hopkins were filled with patients, most of them black and unable to pay their medical bills. David drove Henrietta nearly 20 miles to get there, not because they preferred it, but because it was the only major hospital for miles that would treat Black patients. This was the era of Jim Crow. When Black people showed up at a white-only hospital, the staff was likely to send them away, even if it meant dying in the parking lot. Even Hopkins, which did treat Black patients, segregated them into what they called colored wards and had color-only drinking fountains, end quote. On January 29, 1951, David Lacks dropped Henrietta off at Johns Hopkins to see the doctor. It's apparently said that if you kiss the foot of the Jesus statue inside the building, it's supposed to give you good luck. Henrietta's family always did this, and they had never had any severe issues in the past. This one time, though, Henrietta was running late, and she didn't want to miss her appointment, so she didn't. Some of her family members still believe to this day that that played a role in what happened to her. When she was finally called in to be examined by Howard Jones, the OBGYN on call, he decided to take a look. When he did, he found a lump exactly where Henrietta said it would be. He later wrote that it was shiny and purple like grape jello, and so delicate that it bled at the slightest touch, something he'd never seen before. And 3 months ago, when she had come in for a checkup, there had been no sign of a tumor, as noted in her file, and Dr. Jones was shocked, because that meant her tumor had to have grown at a terrifyingly fast rate. They proceeded to perform a biopsy. On February 5th, Henrietta got her diagnosis. She had epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix level 1, which meant really nothing to her or her family, which didn't know what most of those words meant. She told her family that the doctors were going to fix her up and she'd be just fine. She proceeded to begin radium treatment, which was the staple treatment for invasive cancers at the time. But before this treatment, though, they told her they needed a sample of her tissues to make sure the treatment would be successful. But they took another sample, 2 samples. And without her knowledge or permission, one of those samples was given to Dr. George Guy. George Guy was the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. From Skloot's book, quote, Guy and his wife Margaret had spent the last 3 decades working to grow malignant cells outside the body, hoping to use them to find cancer's cause and cure. But most cells died quickly, and the few that survived hardly grew at all. The Guys were determined to grow the first immortal human cells, a continuously dividing line of cells, all from one sample. Cells that would consistently replenish themselves and never die. 8 years earlier, in 1943, a group of researchers had proven that this was possible, but with mouse cells. The Guys wanted the human equivalent. They didn't care what kind of tissue they used, as long as it came from a person. Guy took any cells he could get his hands on, and he even called himself the world's most famous vulture, feeding on human specimens almost constantly. So when Guy was offered a supply of cervical cancer tissue in exchange for trying to grow some cells, he didn't hesitate. And Hopkins began collecting samples from any woman who happened to walk into their hospital with cervical cancer without their knowledge or consent, including Henrietta. In fact, Howard Jones, the gynecologist we mentioned earlier, actually wrote regarding the samples, and he said, quote, Hopkins, with its large indigent Black population, has no dearth of clinical material, end quote. A resident took Henrietta's cells to Guy's lab with the expectation that they would die just like all the others. In fact, Guy's 21-year-old assistant, Mary Kubisek, when presented with a sample, simply decided that she would get to it after she finished her sandwich. The thousands of other samples that she had cultured had never survived, and her expectations were extremely low. To Mary, there was nothing different about these cells, at least on the surface. She's actually stated that she remembers thinking to herself, not another sample. Why am I even bothering? But after lunch was over, like all of us, she had to get back to work. Following the procedures she was taught, she began the process of seeing if these cells could live in test tubes. And carefully, she wrote HeLa on the side of each of the test tubes for Henrietta Lacks. 2 days after Henrietta had finished her first treatment successfully, Mary began to see white clots at the bottom of each tube. She didn't think much of it. Cells had survived for a short period of time before and quickly died off. But Henrietta's cells weren't merely surviving. They were growing with mythological intensity. By the next morning, they doubled. So she divided the contents of the tube into two, giving them room to grow. And within 24 hours, they doubled again. Soon, she was dividing them into 4 tubes, then 6. Henrietta's cells grew to fill as much space as Mary gave them. Guy told her they could die any minute and not to get too excited, but they didn't. Mary actually remembers saying, "They grew like crabgrass." Her cancer cells grew 20 times faster than her normal cells, which died only a few days after being cultured. Henrietta, on the other hand, had come back for a second round of treatments and had no idea that Guy was setting up to sell and give her cells to anyone who wanted them. In fact, she went home after her completed treatments and seemed perfectly fine until she got her next period, and the blood didn't stop. So she returned for another treatment. And the part that really gets to me is she asked her doctors before this next treatment when she could have another baby. And the doctors then realized that they had conveniently forgotten to tell her that radium treatment makes you infertile. It's actually quoted in her medical file that had she known that, she would not have even received the first treatment. But as Henrietta got worse and eventually asked herself to be checked into the hospital, her cells continued to proliferate in the lab. Guy began to give these cells to people and companies who wanted to use them for medical research. In fact, Guy often referred to her cells as his precious babies. The reason Henrietta's cells were so precious was because they allowed scientists to perform experiments that would have been impossible with a living human. They cut HeLa cells apart and exposed them to endless toxins, radiation, and infections. They bombarded them with drugs, hoping to find one that would kill malignant cells without destroying normal ones. They studied immune suppression and cancer growth by injecting HeLa cells into immune-compromised rats, which developed malignant tumors much like Henrietta's. If the cells died in the process, it didn't matter. They could just go back to their eternally growing HeLa stock and start all over. Meanwhile, Henrietta's name was never known or mentioned. No one knew who HeLa was, really cared, and Henrietta still had no clue that her cells were even being used. She was getting sicker and sicker too, the cancer moving throughout her body, and yet still the doctors were taking more and more samples from her cervix to send to George Guy without her knowledge or consent. Except these samples were not usable because her body was so full of toxins, with her kidneys unable to filter her blood, that the cells died almost immediately. Her family had no idea that she was so close to death. They thought the doctors were still trying to cure her. New tumors began to appear daily and all over her body, one on her uterus, one on each kidney, and on her urethra, before ending up on her lymph nodes, hip bones, and labia. Her doctors even documented that she was miserable, and no pain treatment they had was even working, including injecting alcohol into her spine. Henrietta died at 12:15 a.m. on October 4th of the same year she was diagnosed, at 31 years old. There was no obituary for Henrietta. No one in the family could afford one, but once George Guy found out that she had died, he wanted to find a way to convince the family for an autopsy. Interestingly enough, it wasn't required at the time to get consent on a living person, but once they were dead, you had to get permission for an autopsy, and then you could use whatever you wanted. So all they had to get was the permission for the autopsy. And the way Day Lacks, Henrietta's husband, remembers it, they called him, asked him for an autopsy, and he said no. When they went to the hospital, he says they laid it on thick and told him, if you let us do this autopsy, it'll save your children from dying like your wife. So he said, well, in that case, I guess it won't hurt. Mary, Dr. Guy's lab assistant, who we talked about earlier, was sent in to collect the rest of the samples. As they collected sample after sample, Mary later recounted that she tried to stare at Henrietta's arms and legs and not look into her eyes. But her eyes fell on Henrietta's toes, and she gasped. Her toenails were covered in bright red chipped nail polish. When I saw those toenails, Mary told the author Rebecca Skloot years later, I nearly fainted. I thought, oh geez, she's a real person. I started imagining her sitting in the bathroom painting her toenails, and it hit me for the first time that those cells we've been working with all this time and sending all over the world, they came from a live woman. I'd never thought of it that way, end quote. A few days later, Henrietta was brought back to Clover in a wood coffin by her husband and buried in an unmarked grave. Again, they didn't have the money, but her family was there. Her family says they barely remember the memorial service. They were pretty sure there were some words spoken and probably some songs sung, but they all remember what happened after the coffin went in the ground and they started to throw dirt on it. One of the worst storms in the town's history began. Power lines and trees were ripped up. It caused fires that burned all the tobacco fields. It even tore a cabin straight up off the ground and right back down. Years later, when Henrietta's cousin Peter looked back on that day, he just laughed. He said, Henny was never what you would call a beaten around the bush woman. We should have known she was trying to tell us something with that storm. HeLa cells went on to become highly manufactured cells and are the reason we have a cure for polio. They've also now been used in the creation of most medications we take to test human sensitivity, and without HeLa cells, we wouldn't have chemotherapy or in vitro fertilization. HeLa cells went up in the atomic bomb. A scientist accidentally poured a chemical on a HeLa cell that spread out its tangled chromosomes, and later scientists used this technique to determine that humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, and not 48 like they thought, which provided the basis for making several types of genetic diagnoses. It was also discovered that Lacks' cancerous cells had an enzyme called telomerase, which repaired the DNA, so cancer cells like it wouldn't die. Anti-cancer drugs that work against this enzyme are currently in clinical trials. HeLa has been used to study salmonella, HIV, TB, and is one of the main reasons we have a link between HPV and cancer. HeLa cells went to space before humans did, and scientists have grown over 20 tons of her cells, and it is now estimated that there are more HeLa cells alive right now than ever lived in her body during her entire life. There are almost 11,000 patents on her cells. HeLa is indeed an amazing medical discovery, and most of us, if not all of us here today, have benefited from Henrietta's cells in some way, and so have the drug companies. People wishing to use HeLa cells buy them at up to $250 a vial. Yet, Henrietta's family had no idea these cells and this part of their mother existed until the late 1970s. When Johns Hopkins called Day and his children with Henrietta to ask them to give samples. They were told that they were being tested to see if they had cancer, but really they were being tested to see if their cells were similar to their mom's. How did they find out? Well, the research assistants weren't told that the family didn't know, so they let it slip. Why did this baffle them though? Because they knew that neither them nor their mother had ever signed permission for anyone to use her cells. And they'd never seen a dime from all of these people who supposedly were using their mom's cells. It was evident to them, and still extremely evident today, that Henrietta's race played a large factor in this. In fact, some people at the time said that because she was receiving free services from Hopkins, which was mostly contingent on the fact that she was African American, they had a right to do what they wanted with her cells without her permission. But to this day, Henrietta's children, grandchildren, and husband can still not afford health insurance. They cannot afford to benefit from almost everything their mom's cells have made. When I learned about Henrietta and her story, I couldn't help but realize I have a polio vaccine. I've benefited from Henrietta's cells, and in fact, because of that, some of her cells are inside of me. Pieces of Henrietta Lacks live inside of me, inside of pretty much all of us. And I realized then that I wanted to bring Henrietta's story to the awareness of Unitarian Universalists, and I wondered why we weren't already talking about her. Deborah, Henrietta's daughter, says that she thinks part of the reason Henrietta's story is so powerful to us is because of that piece of Henrietta inside of us is kind of bugging us to get her story out and make sure people know who she is. I think Henrietta's story provides us with an interesting dilemma for us as Unitarian Universalists. We have two principles that we tend to value extremely highly. First, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, as well as the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which I've always kind of seen as our scientific principle. Kind of gives us permission to believe in science and that whole thing. Our faith, to me, tends to value science very highly. Scientific progress, as well as scientific fact or theories. And that's not something I'm criticizing. In fact, it's one of the things I love most about this faith. I can come here and have discussions about evolution and then come sit down 20 minutes later and pray. I can discuss new scientific findings with other people and marvel at how amazing science is and how far things have come. But I can also sit in community with others and learn about their lives and be connected spiritually. I get both sides of the coin, or as I've always wanted to do, I get to have my cake and eat it too. But the story of Henrietta places an interesting conundrum for us. How do we deal with this? Typically, when we look at unethical standards, our first reaction is to boycott. We talk about Walmart or Monsanto and all of these things. And we try to talk about not supporting companies that don't have fair wages or practice ethical standards. We try to educate people on why they should or shouldn't shop certain places and get the word out. But that's almost impossible in this case. Unless you do extensive research and are really well-versed in scientific lingo, you're going to have no idea whether or not Henrietta's cells have been used to test medication you're on. And her family actually doesn't want you to boycott. In fact, on their new official Lacks family website, they say Henrietta Lacks is the gift that keeps on giving. But that doesn't get rid of the ethical dilemma. And I have spent so much time trying to figure out how to make this right. I've benefited from Henrietta, and most likely will continue to do so. So what in the world could I do to make this sit right with my soul? I had no idea, but I decided to ask Reverend Andy for a sermon anyway. And because I was shocked the more UUs were talking about this woman, we weren't writing sermons or blog posts. We weren't talking about her. We didn't know who she was. I felt like I just had to tell her story. In fact, Andy asked me, "So what angle are you coming at this with?" And I kind of stared at him and I said, "Ethics?" It was probably that piece of Henrietta and me kind of like, just say what he wants you to say. And I realized that maybe it was the fact that I like to think I have a way with words. I have a way of making people listen to me, and whether that's because people want to and I'm commanding, or whether it's because, quite honestly, my voice is so dang loud. People tend to pay attention when I talk. Maybe that was the way I could do Henrietta justice, by telling her story. Her story moved me. This woman who had made such a huge impact on all of us and had never received recognition and had no idea that she was going to make this impact on us. A woman who without medical science would be at a huge disadvantage, and for all we know, the eradication of polio may not have happened until many more lives were lost or affected. My grandfather was affected with polio. I wanted today's service to honor Henrietta and her memory and her family. So we sang African American spirituals like her children said she sang around the house, and Tamara sang a beautiful country music song because she's from the South, and yeah, country music. And then our offertory words honored her Christian tradition. A piece of Henrietta lives in all of us. And I encourage you to discuss with people here after the service, as well as VUU members not here. You can come discuss with me. To talk to your friends and your family, talk to everyone you know, and spread the good news of Henrietta Lacks. Remember that this woman is behind those cells, and that this is one of 2 pictures that exist of her, because they didn't have money for any more. Remember that she lives in us. How will you honor her memory? Thank you.